August 18th, 1590. After nearly 3 years away, John White was finally back on Roanoke Island. He had left more than 100 English settlers here, including his daughter, his son-in-law, and his newborn granddaughter, but when he reached the settlement, there was nobody there. No families waiting for him, no guards, no children, no bodies. The houses had been taken apart, the boats were missing, and the settlement had been surrounded by a wooden defensive wall. Then White noticed something carved into a tree. 3 letters, C-R-O, and a little farther inside the settlement, carved into a wooden post, was the full word, Croatoan. For more than 4 centuries, that word has become one of the most famous clues in American history. A colony of 117 people had suddenly disappeared, and this is what they left behind. But there is something strange about the mystery of Roanoke, because when John White saw the word Croatoan, he wasn't confused. He was relieved. He thought he knew exactly where the settlers had gone, and that changes this story completely. To understand what happened, we have to go back several years, because the famous Lost Colony wasn't England's first attempt to settle this part of North America. During the 1580s, England was trying to establish a permanent presence across the Atlantic. Spain already controlled enormous territories in the Americas and had become incredibly wealthy from its own empire. England wanted its own foothold. Sir Walter Raleigh received permission from Queen Elizabeth I to establish a colony in North America, and in 1585, an English expedition created a settlement on Roanoke Island, along the coast of what is now North Carolina. But the first Roanoke colony was not really a community. It was primarily a military outpost. And almost immediately, things started going wrong. Supplies were damaged, food became a problem, and relations with the indigenous communities living in the region deteriorated badly. During one incident, the English believed that a silver cup had been stolen from them. In retaliation, the English burned a nearby indigenous village and its crops. Violence continued, and by 1586, the English colony was struggling badly enough that when a fleet commanded by Sir Francis Drake appeared offshore, the colonists abandoned Roanoke and returned to England. The experiment had lasted less than a year, but Walter Raleigh wasn't finished. A second colony was organized for 1587. This one would be different. Instead of being dominated by soldiers, it included ordinary settlers, men, women, people who were supposed to build something permanent. And perhaps most importantly, they weren't actually supposed to settle on Roanoke Island. Their planned destination was farther north, around Chesapeake Bay. Roanoke was supposed to be a stop along the way. The settlers would check on a small English garrison that had been left behind from the previous expedition. Then they would continue north and establish their new colony. At least that was the plan. When the expedition reached Roanoke in July 1587, John White and several men went ashore. They expected to find the English soldiers who had been left there. Instead, they found essentially nothing. They eventually discovered human bones believed to belong to one of the missing men. The warning could have hardly been clearer. The previous English settlement had failed. The remaining garrison had apparently been killed or driven away. Relations in the region were already unstable, and this was not where the new colonists were supposed to stay anyway. And then the entire plan changed. Simón Fernández, the expedition's pilot, refused to take them any farther. He argued that it was already too late in the season to continue. The settlers would not be going to Chesapeake Bay. They were staying at Roanoke. So the new settlers began repairing the abandoned buildings, and within days, the situation became worse. One colonist, George Howe, was killed while away from the settlement. The English blamed members of the Roanoke people. They launched a retaliatory attack, but in the darkness, they attacked the wrong group. The people they were attacking were the Croatoans, the same community that had generally been friendlier toward the English. One Croatoan man in particular was extremely important. His name was Manteo. He traveled to England, he worked with the colonists, and he had helped the English communicate with people throughout the region. Suddenly, even one of the colony's most important relationships had been damaged. Within weeks, they were stranded in the wrong location, short on supplies, and already caught in renewed violence. Then, on August 18th, something happened that seemed far more hopeful. John White's daughter, Eleanor, gave birth. The baby was named Virginia Dare. She became the first child born to English parents in the English colony. But 9 days later, her grandfather sailed away. It would be easy to assume John White simply abandoned the colony, but the colonists themselves wanted someone to return to England. They needed more supplies. They needed support from Raleigh. When nobody else volunteered, they formally asked their governor, John White, to make the journey. White didn't want to leave. His daughter was staying behind, so was his newborn granddaughter. But on August 27th, 1587, only about 5 weeks after the colony had arrived, White sailed for England. He expected to organize supplies and come back. The settlers would have to survive without him in the meantime. Before White left, however, the two sides apparently discussed what would happen if the colony needed to move. And this detail is crucial. If the settlers abandoned Roanoke, they were supposed to carve the name of their new location somewhere where White could find it. And if they had been forced to leave because they were in danger, they were supposed to add a cross. The message was essentially a forwarding address. White left, and then almost everything that could go wrong did. White reached England in late 1587, and almost immediately a much larger crisis pushed a tiny settlement thousands of kilometers away down the list of priorities. England was preparing for war with Spain. The Spanish Armada was coming. Ships were desperately needed for the defense of England, making it extremely difficult for White to organize another expedition across the Atlantic. He did manage to leave with 2 small ships in 1588, but that attempt also failed. The ships became separated and were involved in fighting with French vessels before eventually returning to England. Roanoke would have to wait. Think about that from the settlers' perspective. They had watched John White sail away expecting supplies. Then months passed. Winter came, no ship appeared. Another summer passed. Another winter. And we now know something they couldn't possibly have understood at the time. Tree ring evidence shows that Roanoke entered an extraordinary drought just as the settlers arrived. The drought lasted from 1587 through 1589. According to the reconstruction, it was the driest 3-year period in roughly 800 years of evidence. That didn't necessarily kill the colonists, but it would have made an already difficult situation significantly worse. Crops suffered, food available for trade with neighboring communities would have also been scarcer, and the settlers had no way of knowing whether another English ship was ever coming. White had been delayed in England at almost the worst possible time. By 1590, White finally found passage on a privateering expedition. This wasn't a major rescue mission carrying replacement colonists and mountains of supplies. White had essentially found a way back aboard ships that were crossing the Atlantic for other reasons. On August 16th, they reached the Outer Banks, 3 years after White had left. Now he just had to find his colony. The return was difficult almost immediately. Bad weather made landing dangerous. A boat capsized and several sailors drowned. Then, as White's group approached Roanoke, they saw something promising. Fire. Maybe the colonists were still there. That night, the sailors remained offshore. They sounded a trumpet. They called toward the island. They even sang familiar English songs. Nobody answered. When daylight came, they went ashore. White noticed footprints. Then he saw the first carving, C-R-O, and he immediately recognized what it meant. Remember the agreement they had 3 years earlier? If the colonists moved, they would carve their destination. If they were forced to leave, they would add a cross. The men continued toward the settlement. The houses White remembered were gone. Not burned, not smashed apart in a battle, taken down. A large wooden palisade now surrounded the area, and carved into one of its posts was the complete message, Croatoan. There was no cross, which suggests that the colonists had not been forced to leave. Heavy objects that would have been difficult to transport had been abandoned, but the colony's boats were gone. White's own belongings, which had been buried before the settlers left, had later been dug up and damaged. From White's perspective, the explanation seemed obvious. The settlers had moved, and they were trying to tell him where. Croatoan was not a mysterious word. It was the name of both an indigenous community and a nearby island associated with them, generally connected with modern Hatteras Island. Manteo himself was Croatoan. White believed his family and the settlers had gone there. He even described his reaction as one of joy. After 3 years of imagining what might have happened, he thought he had found evidence that they were alive. So the obvious next step was simple: sail to Croatoan, find the settlers, mystery solved. Except White never made it there. The ships were already in trouble. They had lost anchors, the weather was getting worse, and attempting to remain near the dangerous Outer Banks risked wrecking the ship entirely. White wanted to continue searching, but conditions eventually forced the expedition away from the coast. He never reached Croatoan. He never reached Virginia. He never saw his daughter again, and he never returned to Roanoke. That is the moment the lost colony truly becomes lost. Not necessarily when the settlers left the island, but when the one person who understood their message was prevented from following it. One possibility is that survivors never survived Roanoke at all. Violence, starvation, and disease could have all killed people here. Violence had already taken place throughout the region. The previous English garrison had disappeared. George Howe had been killed shortly after the 1587 settlers arrived, and the English themselves had made enemies through earlier attacks. Years later, settlers at Jamestown would hear reports suggesting that Roanoke had eventually been killed. So violence cannot simply be dismissed. But there is a problem with the idea that the entire colony died at Roanoke. White didn't find a battlefield, burned houses, or a settlement destroyed in an attack. He found buildings that appeared to have been deliberately dismantled. The colonists' boats were missing, and most importantly, they had left a message White had specifically asked them to leave if they relocated. Without the cross that was supposed to indicate distress, that doesn't prove nobody was later killed. They could have survived Roanoke, moved somewhere else, and encountered violence afterward. But the evidence White actually found fits an organized departure much better than a sudden massacre at the colony itself. Did they starve? The colonists had requested additional food and supplies almost immediately, and we know they had arrived during an extreme drought, which could have left them vulnerable to hunger, illness, and even death. If more than 100 people had simply remained at Roanoke until they died, would we expect the site to look very different? Starvation doesn't explain why the houses were dismantled, the boats had disappeared, and useful objects had been removed, and somebody had taken the time to carve their destination into the settlement. Starvation may still be one of the most important pieces of the story, not because it necessarily killed everyone, it may have been the reason they left. Staying on Roanoke and waiting indefinitely for England may have become more dangerous than abandoning the colony entirely. We also know the colonists had access to smaller vessels, and when White returned, he couldn't find signs of any of them. The missing boats suggest they may have traveled by water. Sailing all the way back across the Atlantic would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible. But there were other destinations much closer. One possibility was Chesapeake Bay. Remember, that was where the settlers had originally intended to establish their colony. Maybe they eventually decided to finish the journey themselves. By reaching Chesapeake Bay meant navigating dangerous coastal waters, and no archaeologist has been able to definitively identify any of the discoveries as part of the missing colony. The boats may simply have helped them reach somewhere much closer, and there was one destination staring White directly in the face. The Croatoan people had been among the English colony's closest relationships in the area. Manteo came from that community, and White himself believed that was where the settlers had gone. Archaeologists working around modern Hatteras Island have also uncovered European objects from the relevant period. Most recently, researchers reported finding hammer scale there, tiny flakes produced when iron is forged. That is interesting because iron working could indicate Europeans were actually living in the community rather than European objects simply arriving there through trade. Again, the evidence has not produced universal agreement. European objects alone cannot identify the people who carried them. Before White left in 1587, he recorded that the colonists were already preparing to move roughly 50 miles inland. For centuries, nobody knew exactly what that meant. Then researchers looked more closely at a map made by John White himself. The map contains small pieces of paper pasted over certain areas. In 2012, researchers working with the British Museum examined what was underneath one of them. Hidden beneath the patch was a symbol resembling a fort. Its location was around the western end of Albemarle Sound, roughly 50 miles from Roanoke. Archaeologists began searching the area. At a location they called Site X, they found the English artifacts dating from the period, including fragments of pottery. But Site X appeared too small to have contained the entire colony. That led to another possibility. Maybe there wasn't one new Roanoke. Maybe the settlers split up, and the search continued. Archaeologists searching inland have continued finding Elizabethan era material. In June 2026, the First Colony Foundation made its strongest claim yet. The organization announced that it believes the lost colony has effectively been found. Its researchers argued that evidence from two inland locations, Site X and Site Y, may represent parts of the missing colony. According to the Foundation, Site X may represent a small group of settlers living near the indigenous community. Site Y has produced a larger collection of Elizabethan artifacts, suggesting a larger English presence. Instead of rebuilding one large fortified settlement, they believe the colonists may have spread out along the Chelwyn River in smaller farms and communities. That would make a lot of sense for people trying to survive. A colony of 117 people, concentrated in one place, needed enormous amounts of food. Smaller groups spread across better farmland could be easier to support. The claim has not been universally accepted. The First Colonies Foundation June 2026 announcement comes from the team conducting the research. Artifacts from this period can be extremely difficult to connect to one specific group of English settlers. Objects could have reached the area in other ways, through earlier expeditions or through trade. And so far, there are no graves, documents, or surviving buildings that conclusively tie these sites to the 117 settlers. But the inland theory is no longer based on purely speculation. There is real archaeological evidence pointing in that direction. And now the evidence seems to point in more than one direction. Evidence pointing south toward Croatoan, evidence pointing west towards the mainland, and historical records suggesting the settlers had already discussed leaving Roanoke. These possibilities don't necessarily contradict each other, because 117 people didn't have to stay together. And this is what makes the lost colony so interesting. How do 117 people vanish without a trace? But that may be the wrong question. There were traces. The settlers dismantled their homes, they took their boats, they moved useful equipment, they even left a message. They told John White before he left that they were considering moving inland. Then White returned, read that message, and believed he knew where they were. The mystery exists partly because he never got the chance to check. After that, England lost contact with them, and once the settlers were no longer living together as an English colony, the historical record becomes extremely difficult to follow. We may never know exactly what happened to Eleanor Dare or 3-year-old Virginia. We may never know how many people went inland, how many went toward Croatoan, how many died during the drought, or how many eventually became part of the indigenous communities already living there. And despite some very confident modern claims, archaeology still hasn't given us enough evidence to reconstruct the fate of all 117 people. People at Roanoke were isolated, running short of supplies, and living through an extraordinary drought. They were surrounded by communities with whom they had complicated relationships, while waiting for a ship that failed to return for 3 years. At some point, at least some of them appeared to have stopped waiting. Maybe the biggest mystery of Roanoke isn't how 117 people disappeared. Maybe it's how a story about people moving to survive became a story about people vanishing without a trace.